Sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones nobody can see. In the Wyoming Territory of 1889, there lived a woman who had forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen by another soul. For 3 years, she hid behind a dark cloak on her father's abandoned land. The townsfolk called her the Cloaked One and whispered she was cursed or mad. Nobody dared come close until Barrett Sloan rode into town. This cattle baron had come to settle his brother's affairs, not solve mysteries. But when morning fog brought them face to face, he saw something in her eyes that stirred his heart. She had been hiding from the world, and he had been hiding from himself. What secret could drive a woman to live like a ghost? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Barrett Sloan pulled his silver pocket watch from his vest, its familiar weight both comfort and torment. The timepiece had stopped at 3:47, the exact moment his brother Thomas had drawn his last breath in that cramped hotel room 2 states away. Barrett had wound it every morning for 23 years, but since that telegram arrived, he couldn't bring himself to set it running again. Time, it seemed, had stopped for him too. The October wind carried the scent of pine and distant snow as Barrett's carriage rolled through the main street of Millbrook, Wyoming Territory. Wooden storefronts lined the dusty thoroughfare, their painted signs weathered by high-altitude sun and winter storms. The Copper Bell Saloon stood at one end, its bat-winged doors swinging lazily in the breeze. At the other end, the whitewashed church steeple pierced the mountain sky like a prayer made manifest. This wasn't the kind of place Barrett Sloan usually found himself. Back in Colorado, his cattle empire stretched across 3 counties, 10,000 head of prime beef, modern ranch houses with electric lighting, and a main house that rivaled anything in Denver. He'd built it all from nothing after the war, driven by grief and an iron will that impressed even his competitors. But success, he'd learned, couldn't fill the hollow spaces in a man's chest. Barrett's driver, an old Mexican named Santos, who'd worked for the Sloan family for 15 years, guided the team toward the town's modest hotel. "Senor Barrett," Santos said over his shoulder, "this place, it has the feeling of secrets, no?" Indeed it did. Barrett had noticed it the moment they'd crested the ridge and looked down into the valley. Millbrook sat cradled between towering peaks like a secret whispered between mountains. The town seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen, or perhaps hoping something would remain hidden. "The lawyer's office should be just ahead," Barrett said, consulting the letter that had brought him here. His brother's final business, a mining claim, some equipment, and debts that needed settling. Thomas had always been the wanderer of the family, chasing gold strikes and silver dreams, while Barrett built something lasting. Now Thomas was gone, and Barrett was left to clean up the pieces of another man's broken ambitions. The Millbrook Hotel proved modest but clean. Mrs. Abernathy, the proprietress, was a sturdy woman with graying hair and eyes that missed nothing. She signed him in with efficient movements, her pen scratching across the register book. "You'll be wanting the corner room," she said without looking up. "Good view of the mountains, and it's quiet. Most folks prefer quiet when they come to settle family business." Barrett paused, his hand halfway to his pocket for payment. "How did you know?" "Word travels fast in a town this size, Mr. Sloan. Thomas spoke of you often. Said his brother was the successful one, the one who figured out how to make money instead of just chase it." Mrs. Abernathy's expression softened slightly. "He was proud of you, you know, even if he never said so directly." The words hit Barrett like a physical blow. Thomas proud of him? They'd barely spoken in 5 years, their relationship strained by Barrett's disapproval of his brother's lifestyle and Thomas's resentment of Barrett's success. Their last conversation had been an argument about money, Barrett refusing to fund another of Thomas's ventures, Thomas accusing him of being cold and calculating. "Thank you," Barrett managed. "I'd like that room." After settling his belongings, Barrett walked the short distance to the office of J.P. Morrison, attorney at law. Morrison proved to be a thin, nervous man, with spectacles that perpetually slipped down his nose. Thomas's affairs were more complicated than expected. The mining claim was worthless, but there were also debts to local merchants and a storage fee for equipment at the old Hartwell place. "The Hartwell place?" Barrett asked. "Where's that?" Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "About 2 miles north of town, old homestead. Been abandoned for years, except—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Well, there's been someone living there, sort of." "What do you mean, sort of?" "There's a woman, Evangeline Hartwell, though folks just call her the Cloaked One. She's been there since her father died 3 years back, keeps to herself, never shows her face. Your brother stored some mining equipment in one of the outbuildings, paid the storage fee to her directly, from what I understand." Barrett felt a prickle of interest. "Why does she hide her face?" Morrison lowered his voice. "Nobody knows for certain. Some say she was disfigured in the fire that killed her mother. Others think she went mad with grief when her father passed. The charitable folks figure she's just shy and peculiar. But there are darker stories too, such as, some say she's cursed, that she sees things others can't, knows things she shouldn't. Old Pete Garrison swears he saw her talking to empty air one evening, having a full conversation with someone who wasn't there. Course, Pete's been known to sample his own moonshine a bit too freely." Barrett studied the attorney's face. Morrison was clearly a rational man, educated and practical. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of unease, that suggested even he wasn't entirely convinced the stories were nonsense. "I'll need to retrieve my brother's equipment," Barrett said. "When would be a good time to visit?" "Well," Morrison said slowly, "that's the thing. Nobody just visits the Hartwell place. She doesn't receive callers. Your best bet would be to catch her during one of her walks early morning, usually, when the fog's thick. She ventures out then, though she stays away from the main roads." Barrett left the lawyer's office with more questions than answers. As evening settled over Millbrook, he found himself at the Copper Bells Saloon, hoping to learn more about the mysterious woman who held his brother's final possessions. The saloon was warm and inviting, filled with the low murmur of conversation and the clink of glasses. Barrett ordered whiskey and struck up conversations with the locals. The stories about Evangeline Hartwell varied wildly, but certain details remained consistent. She'd been beautiful once, before whatever tragedy had befallen her. Her father, Jeremiah Hartwell, had been a respected rancher until a series of disasters drove him to drink and despair. The fire that killed her mother had indeed left marks, but the nature and extent of those marks depended on who was telling the tale. "I seen her once," said a grizzled prospector named Jake. "Was coming back from checking my claims up north. Sun wasn't quite up yet, and there was this fog rolling through the valley like the breath of ghosts. And there she was, just standing by that old oak tree near the creek, had her cloak pulled up tight, but I could see her hands pale as moonlight. She was just standing there, not moving, like she was listening to something I couldn't hear." "Did she see you?" Barrett asked. Jake shook his head. "Don't think so. I backed away, quiet-like. Something about the whole scene just felt private, you know? Like I was seeing something I wasn't meant to see." As the evening progressed, Barrett found himself increasingly intrigued by the mystery of Evangeline Hartwell. Here was a woman who had chosen complete isolation over whatever lay beyond her hidden world. What could drive someone to such extremes? And why did her story resonate so deeply with his own sense of disconnection from life? He thought of his own isolation back in Colorado, his grand house where he ate dinner alone every night, surrounded by servants who respected his privacy too much to intrude with conversation. He thought of the social gatherings he attended out of obligation, where he played the role of successful widower but felt like a ghost among the living. Perhaps he and this mysterious woman had more in common than anyone might suspect. That night, Barrett lay in his hotel bed, listening to the mountain wind and thinking about the silver pocket watch on his nightstand. Time had stopped for him when Margaret died, giving birth to their stillborn son. Then it had stopped again when Thomas died, with angry words still hanging between them. Now, in this strange little town with its hidden woman, he wondered if it was possible for time to start moving forward again. Tomorrow, he decided, he would venture out to the Hartwell place, not just to retrieve Thomas's equipment, but to see for himself the woman who lived like a ghost in the shadow of the mountains. Something about her story called to him in a way he couldn't quite name, a recognition of kindred spirits, perhaps, both hiding from a world that had proven too painful to fully engage. The wind picked up outside his window, carrying with it the promise of winter and change. Barrett closed his eyes and, for the first time in months, allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the only soul in the world who understood what it meant to live with invisible wounds. Barrett woke before dawn, drawn by an instinct he couldn't quite name. The hotel room was still dark, but something, perhaps the quality of silence outside his window, told him this was the right time. He dressed quietly, pulling on his traveling coat and boots, then slipped out of the hotel into the pre-dawn stillness. The air was crisp and thin, carrying the promise of winter in its bite. Fog rolled down from the mountains like a living thing, transforming familiar shapes into mysterious shadows. Barrett had memorized the directions to the Hartwell place from his conversations the night before, and he set out on foot, preferring to approach quietly rather than announce his presence with the clatter of a horse and buggy. The road north of town was little more than a dirt track, rutted by wagon wheels and softened by autumn rains. On either side, tall pines stood like sentinels, their branches disappearing into the grey mist above. Barrett found himself walking more carefully than usual, as if the fog demanded reverence or perhaps secrecy. After 20 minutes of steady walking, he saw it, a weathered wooden gate hanging askew on rusted hinges. Beyond it, a narrow path wound through overgrown pasture toward a cluster of buildings barely visible through the mist. The main house was a modest 2-story structure with a sagging front porch and missing shutters. Outbuildings scattered around it spoke of a working ranch that had seen better days, a barn with gaps in its roof, a chicken coop with no chickens, and several smaller storage sheds. Barrett pushed through the gate, wincing as the old hinges groaned in protest. He was trespassing, technically, but his brother's equipment was somewhere on this property, and he had every right to reclaim it. Still, something about the place made him move carefully, as if sudden movements might shatter whatever delicate peace had settled over the abandoned homestead. He was examining the nearest outbuilding when he saw her. At first, she was just another shadow among shadows, a darker patch of fog near the old oak tree that Jake the prospector had mentioned. But as Barrett's eyes adjusted, the shadow took shape. A woman stood beneath the massive tree, completely still, draped in a dark cloak that covered her from head to toe. Only her hands were visible, pale and graceful, resting at her sides. Barrett froze. He was perhaps 50 feet away, close enough to see that she was facing away from him, toward the mountains. Close enough to see that her posture suggested not fear or alertness, but something deeper, a kind of communion with the morning silence. She seemed to be listening, just as Jake had described, though to what, Barrett couldn't imagine. He should have announced himself, should have called out politely, identified himself as Thomas Sloan's brother, explained his legitimate business on the property. Instead, he found himself studying her with the intensity of a man who had stumbled upon a rare and skittish creature. There was something hauntingly beautiful about her stillness, the way she seemed to belong to this misty landscape as naturally as the ancient oak itself. Her cloak was well made, despite its obvious age. Wool, by the look of it, dyed a deep brown that was almost black. It covered her completely, the hood drawn up to hide her face and hair. Barrett took a careful step closer, and then another. The fog seemed to muffle all sound, even his own footsteps. He was perhaps 30 feet away when she spoke, her voice soft, but carrying clearly in the still air. "You walk like a man who's used to being in charge," she said without turning around. Heavy steps, confident placement, But you're trying to be quiet now. Why? Barrett's breath caught. Her voice was refined, cultured, not what he'd expected from a woman who lived like a hermit. There was no fear in it, no surprise. She had known he was there all along. Barrett began, then stopped. What could he say? That he'd been drawn here by curiosity, that something about her story had called to him in the dark hours before dawn. You're Thomas Sloane's brother, she continued, still facing away from him. Barrett, isn't it? I wondered when you'd come. How did you know I was here? Barrett asked, finding his voice. How did you know who I am? Now she did turn, slowly, though she kept her head angled down so that the hood shadowed her features completely. Barrett could see only the faint curve of her chin and the graceful line of her neck. Your brother spoke of you, she said simply. Often. He was proud of you, though he'd never admit it directly. Said you had the family gift for reading people, for seeing what others missed. I imagine you've already learned more about me from one night in town than most folks know after 3 years. Barrett felt heat rise in his cheeks. I was asking about my brother's equipment. Mr. Morrison said it was stored here. It is. In the barn. You're welcome to take it whenever you like. She paused, tilting her head slightly. But that's not why you're here at dawn, walking through fog like a man afraid of being seen. What are you really doing here, Mr. Sloan? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Barrett found himself at a loss for words, not because he didn't know the answer, but because the truth seemed too intimate to share with a stranger, even one who spoke with such unexpected directness. I wanted to see you, he admitted finally, to understand why someone would choose to live apart from the world. Something in her posture shifted, a slight straightening of her shoulders that might have indicated surprise or approval. And what have you concluded? That perhaps you understand something the rest of us have forgotten, Barrett said, surprising himself with his honesty. Something about the cost of being seen too clearly. She was quiet for a long moment, and Barrett had the sense that he was being measured in some fundamental way. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more vulnerable. Your brother said you were a widower, that you lost your wife and child in the same day. The words hit Barrett like a physical blow. He hadn't spoken of Margaret and the baby to anyone in years. The wound was too deep, too raw, despite the passage of time. That Thomas had shared such intimate details with this stranger felt like both a betrayal and a gift. Yes, he said simply. Then you do understand, she said, about hiding from a world that asks too many questions and offers too few answers. Barrett took another step closer, drawn by something in her voice, a recognition of shared pain that transcended the strange circumstances of their meeting. What happened to you? He asked gently. What made you choose this life? For a moment, he thought she might answer. Her hand moved toward the edge of her hood, as if she might lower it. But then the fog shifted, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell began to toll the morning hour. The spell of their private moment was broken. Your brother's equipment is in the third stall of the barn, she said, her voice returning to its earlier formality. You're welcome to retrieve it at your convenience. She turned away from him then, moving with silent grace toward the house. Barrett wanted to call after her, to ask when he might see her again, but something held him back. This moment felt complete in itself, a gift of unexpected connection that shouldn't be pushed beyond its natural boundaries. Instead, he watched her disappear into the fog, like a ghost returning to whatever realm ghosts inhabited. Only when she was completely gone did he realize that his heart was beating harder than it had in years, and that the silver pocket watch in his vest seemed to pulse with new life against his chest. For the first time since Thomas's death, Barrett Sloan felt fully awake. Barrett spent the rest of that morning in the barn, sorting through Thomas's mining equipment with hands that trembled slightly from something that had nothing to do with the October cold. The conversation with Evangeline Hartwell had shaken something loose inside him, a carefully constructed wall that had kept certain feelings at bay for years. The equipment itself was a sad collection of broken dreams, rusted pickaxes, a dented gold pan, coils of rope that mice had nested in, and a wooden crate filled with surveying tools that would never map another claim. Barrett handled each item with reverence, seeing in them his brother's eternal optimism and restless spirit. Thomas had always believed the next strike would be the big one, the fortune that would justify all the previous failures. As Barrett worked, he found himself glancing toward the house, hoping for another glimpse of the cloaked woman. But the building remained silent, its windows dark behind their weathered shutters. Once he thought he saw movement behind an upstairs curtain, but when he looked again there was nothing. He loaded Thomas's belongings into a rented wagon, but found himself reluctant to leave. The morning's encounter had opened a door he'd kept firmly shut since Margaret's death, and closing it again felt impossible. Instead, he walked the perimeter of the property, taking in details he'd missed in the fog. The remains of what had once been a kitchen garden, now overgrown with weeds. A well with a hand pump that still worked. Fence posts that leaned at odd angles, like old men tired of standing straight. The place had good bones, Barrett realized. With some investment and hard work, it could be a working ranch again. The pastures were fertile, the water source reliable, and the location offered both privacy and access to town. It was the kind of property Barrett might have coveted for one of his own operations if circumstances were different. When he finally returned to town that afternoon, Barrett found himself changed by the morning's events. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds sharper. Even the simple act of ordering lunch at the hotel restaurant required more attention than usual. His mind kept drifting back to Evangeline's voice, the grace of her movements, the way she'd known exactly who he was, without seeing his face. Mrs. Abernathy noticed his distraction immediately. "You have the look of a man who's seen something that surprised him," she observed as she served his coffee. "The Hartwell place," Barrett said carefully. "It's not what I expected." "Few things are when you see them up close," Mrs. Abernathy replied. "Did you meet her?" Barrett nodded, unsure how much to reveal about his encounter. "She's not what folks make her out to be, is she?" The older woman continued, settling into the chair across from him with the familiarity of someone who'd lived in small towns all her life. "Oh, she's different. I'll grant you that. But different doesn't always mean wrong. You know her?" "Knew her father well. Jeremiah Hartwell was a good man who got dealt a bad hand. Lost his wife in that fire, watched his dreams crumble one by one, and finally drank himself into an early grave. But before all that happened, Evangeline was the brightest, most beautiful girl in the territory, had suitors coming from 3 counties away." Barrett felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy, which surprised him. What changed? Mrs. Abernathy's expression grew somber. The fire changed everything. Not just because of what it took from her, but because of what it showed her about how cruel the world could be to those who are different. After that, she just withdrew. Been getting more withdrawn each year since her father passed. "Has anyone tried to help her?" "Help her what? Live the way other folks think she should?" Mrs. Abernathy shook her head. "She's not hurting anyone, Mr. Sloan. She pays her bills when she has money, keeps to herself, and bothers nobody. In a world full of people causing harm to others, seems to me that makes her one of the good ones." That evening, Barrett found himself unable to concentrate on the legal documents Morrison had given him to review. Instead, he sat by his hotel window, watching the sun set behind the mountains and thinking about a woman who chose isolation over the risk of being seen too clearly. He understood that choice in a way that surprised him. After Margaret's death, he'd thrown himself into business not out of ambition, but out of a need to avoid the well-meaning sympathy of others. Building his cattle empire had been a way of staying too busy to feel, too important to be questioned about his personal life. But wealth and success, he realized now, were just more sophisticated forms of the cloak Evangeline wore. They kept people at a careful distance while creating the illusion of engagement with the world. The next morning, Barrett found himself walking the path to the Hartwell place again. He told himself he was going to check if he'd missed anything in the barn, but he knew that wasn't the real reason. The truth was simpler and more complicated. He wanted to see her again. This time, she was waiting for him. She stood by the same oak tree, but now she faced the path, as if she'd been watching for his approach. As Barrett drew closer, he noticed she held something in her hands, a letter, worn with handling. "You came back," she observed, her voice carrying a note he couldn't quite identify. Surprise? Pleasure? Wariness? "I wanted to thank you," Barrett said, stopping a respectful distance away, "for letting me take Thomas's things, and for what you shared yesterday about him. He wrote about you often," she said, holding up the letter. "Near the end, especially. I think he knew his time was running short." Barrett's chest tightened. "What did he say?" "That he wished he'd been more like you, more settled, more successful, but also that he worried you'd forgotten how to live for something other than work." She paused, studying his face from within the shadows of her hood. "He said you used to laugh more before your wife died." The observation hit Barrett with unexpected force. He couldn't remember the last time he'd truly laughed, not the polite chuckles required in business situations, but genuine mirth. Margaret had been able to make him laugh, even during their darkest moments. The baby had been stillborn. But in the hours before Margaret slipped away, she'd whispered jokes about their child joining the angels before learning proper manners. "He wasn't wrong," Barrett admitted. "I've forgotten a lot of things over the years." "Forgetting can be a mercy," Evangeline said softly, "but sometimes what we think we're forgetting is just hiding, waiting for the right moment to resurface." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Barrett turned to see a rider cresting the hill, a young man on a paint horse moving fast toward the homestead. As the rider drew closer, Barrett could see it was someone from town, his face flushed with urgency. "Miss Hartwell," the young man called out as he pulled up short near the gate. "Mrs. Morrison sent me. There's been trouble in town. That mining company from back east, they're saying they have a legal claim to this property. They're at the courthouse now with papers." Barrett felt the world shift beneath his feet. A mining company with a claim to Evangeline's land? The implications hit him immediately. If the claim was legitimate, she would lose not just her home, but her sanctuary. Evangeline stood perfectly still for a long moment, absorbing this news. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but Barrett could hear the underlying tension. "Thank you for riding out to tell me, Billy. I'll handle this." As the young man rode back toward town, Barrett stepped closer to Evangeline. "You're not facing this alone," he said firmly. "I know something about legal battles and mining claims. Let me help you." She turned toward him then, and for just a moment he caught a glimpse of her eyes beneath the hood, startling green, wide with surprise and something that might have been hope. "Why would you do that?" she asked quietly. "You barely know me." Barrett considered the question seriously. The practical answer was that he had the resources and knowledge to help, and helping felt like the right thing to do. But there was something deeper, something he wasn't quite ready to name. "Because," he said finally, "I think we understand each other." The ride back to town tested every ounce of Barrett's self-control. Evangeline had accepted his offer of help with obvious reluctance, agreeing to meet him at Morrison's office only after Barrett pointed out that legal battles were best fought with proper representation. She would not, however, accompany him immediately first. She needed time to gather her father's papers and steel herself for what would be her first public appearance in 3 years. Barrett's mind raced as his rented horse carried him toward Millbrook. Mining companies didn't file claims without doing their research first. If they believed they had legitimate rights to the Hartwell property, they likely possessed documentation that could prove troublesome. But Barrett had learned long ago that the law was often less about justice than about who could afford the better attorneys. The scene at the courthouse confirmed his worst fears. 3 men in expensive suits stood clustered around Morrison's desk, their leather satchels bulging with official-looking documents. The lead figure was a tall, sharp-featured man with silver hair and cold eyes that assessed everything in terms of profit and loss. Barrett recognized the type immediately: corporate predators who viewed small-town lawyers and isolated landowners as easy prey. "Mr. Sloan," Morrison said with obvious relief as Barrett entered, "these gentlemen are from Consolidated Mining Enterprises. They're claiming mineral rights to the Hartwell property." The silver-haired man stepped forward with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Nathaniel Pierce, Senior Acquisitions Manager." "And you are?" "Barrett Sloan, representing Miss Hartwell's interests." Pierce's expression sharpened with interest. "The cattle baron from Colorado? Your reputation precedes you, Mr. Sloan, though I must say, I'm surprised to find you involved in such a modest legal matter." The condescension in Pierce's tone was deliberate, designed to establish dominance. Barrett had encountered similar tactics countless times in business negotiations. He responded with the calm confidence that had served him well in boardrooms from Denver to Chicago. "Miss Hartwell is a friend," Barrett said simply. "I make it a practice to help my friends when they're facing challenges." "How noble," Pierce replied. "However, this is a matter of established law, not personal sentiment. Consolidated Mining has documentation proving our mineral rights supersede any surface claims to the property." Morrison cleared his throat nervously. "The paperwork appears to be in order, Mr. Sloan. There's a mining patent filed in 1877, before Mr. Hartwell ever filed his homestead claim. If legitimate, it would give Consolidated the right to extract mineral resources regardless of surface ownership." Barrett examined the documents with the careful attention he'd learned from years of reviewing contracts. The papers looked authentic, with proper seals and signatures. But something about the dates bothered him, a subtle inconsistency that nagged at his memory. "These records," Barrett said slowly, "they claim the original survey was conducted in late 1877? "That's correct," Pierce replied, his confidence unwavering. "Interesting, because I happen to know that the surveyor listed here, Jonathan Blackwood, died in the summer of 1877, killed in an Apache raid near Tucson." Barrett's voice remained casual, conversational. "I remember because he was working on a contract for my company at the time. We had to hire his replacement to finish the job." The silence that followed was profound. Pierce's confident expression flickered, just for a moment, but long enough for Barrett to recognize he'd struck a nerve. "Perhaps there's been some confusion about dates," Pierce said carefully. "These old records can be—" "No confusion," Barrett interrupted gently. "Just fraudulent documents." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Morrison's eyes widened, and Pierce's two associates shifted nervously. But Pierce himself recovered quickly, his practiced smile returning. "That's a serious allegation, Mr. Sloan. I trust you have evidence to support such a claim?" "I have a very good memory for details, Mr. Pierce, and I have the resources to verify those details through proper channels. The question is, do you want to withdraw your claim voluntarily, or would you prefer to explain to a federal judge why you're using forged documents to steal an innocent woman's land?" Pierce studied Barrett for a long moment, clearly recalculating his approach. When he spoke again, his tone had lost its earlier arrogance. "Perhaps we've been hasty. Consolidated Mining is always willing to negotiate in good faith with property owners. We could discuss a generous lease agreement that would benefit everyone involved." "The lady isn't interested in leasing her land to anyone," Barrett said firmly, "especially not to people who open negotiations with forged documents." "You're making a mistake, Sloan," Pierce said, his veneer of politeness finally cracking. "This territory is changing. Small landowners who don't adapt get swept aside. Miss Hartwell would be wise to consider her limited options." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Barrett felt his own temperature rise, but kept his voice level. "Are you threatening Miss Hartwell, Mr. Pierce?" "I'm simply pointing out business realities. Accidents happen to isolated properties, equipment breaks down, supplies get delayed. Life becomes difficult for people who don't have powerful friends. Barrett stepped closer to Pierce, close enough that his next words carried only to the mining executive's ears. Miss Hartwell has powerful friends now, and I've dealt with men far more dangerous than you, Pierce. If anything, and I mean anything, happens to her or her property, I'll hold you personally responsible. Do we understand each other? Pierce's confident mask slipped entirely, revealing the calculating predator beneath. But he nodded curtly and gathered his papers. This isn't over, Sloan. Yes, it is, Barrett replied quietly. You just don't know it yet. After Pierce and his associates left, Morrison collapsed into his chair with obvious relief. Mr. Sloan, I can't thank you enough. I've never dealt with anything like that before. Men like Pierce prey on people they think can't fight back, Barrett explained. They're bullies, nothing more. But they're also dangerous when cornered, so we need to be prepared for whatever they try next. Barrett spent the next hour reviewing every document related to the Hartwell property, building a comprehensive understanding of the legal landscape. The homestead claim was solid, filed properly and maintained according to territorial law. Pierce's forged mining patent was the only potential complication, and Barrett was confident he could demolish it with proper investigation. But legal victory was only part of the challenge. Pierce had essentially declared war, and men like that didn't accept defeat gracefully. Barrett would need to ensure Evangeline's physical safety while the legal battle played out. As if summoned by his thoughts, Evangeline appeared in the courthouse doorway. She had exchanged her usual cloak for a dark wool dress and a heavy shawl that still concealed most of her features, but Barrett could see enough to confirm what the townspeople had whispered. She was indeed beautiful, with delicate features and graceful bearing that no amount of concealment could entirely hide. Miss Hartwell, Morrison said, rising quickly. Please, come in. She moved with careful dignity, settling into the chair Barrett held for her. Her presence transformed the cramped office, bringing with it an air of quiet strength that impressed Barrett even more than her beauty. Mr. Pierce and his associates have withdrawn their claim, Barrett reported. For now, Evangeline turned toward him, and again he caught a glimpse of those startling green eyes. You mentioned there might be further trouble. Pierce doesn't strike me as the type to give up easily, Barrett admitted. We should be prepared for other approaches. What kind of approaches? She asked quietly. Barrett hesitated, unwilling to frighten her unnecessarily. But she deserved to know what they might be facing. Intimidation tactics, property damage, attempts to make life difficult enough that you'll sell voluntarily. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I think you should consider staying in town for a while. The hotel has rooms. No. Her voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. That place is my home. I won't be driven from it. Barrett recognized the steel beneath her quiet manner, the same determination that had sustained her through 3 years of isolation. He admired it, even as it complicated his desire to protect her. Then we'll find another way to keep you safe, he said simply. The look she gave him then was filled with something he couldn't quite name, surprise, perhaps, or gratitude. But there was also a wariness that suggested she wasn't accustomed to accepting help from anyone. Why are you doing this? She asked. You could have taken your brother's equipment and left town. Why involve yourself in my troubles? Barrett considered the question seriously. The honest answer was that he didn't entirely understand his own motivations. Something about Evangeline Hartwell had awakened feelings he'd thought permanently buried. But that was too intimate a confession for a courthouse office. Because it's the right thing to do, he said finally, and because I suspect you'd do the same for someone in need. She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read his true intentions. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. Thank you, Mr. Sloan. I accept your help. The simple words carried more weight than any business contract Barrett had ever signed. He was committed now not just to a legal battle, but to protecting a woman who had somehow become important to him in ways he was only beginning to understand. 3 days after the courthouse confrontation, Barrett's prediction about Pierce proved accurate. The first sign of trouble came at dawn, the sound of breaking glass that shattered the morning stillness like a gunshot. Barrett, who had taken to camping in the barn at the Hartwell place, despite Evangeline's protests, was on his feet and moving before the echo faded. He found Evangeline standing on her front porch, staring at the ruins of her kitchen window. Scattered across the floor inside were the remains of what had once been her mother's china cabinet, its contents now reduced to glittering fragments. A large stone lay among the wreckage, wrapped with a note that Barrett retrieved carefully. The message was brief and unsigned. "Last warning, sell or face the consequences." "Cowards," Barrett muttered, examining the stone and paper for any identifying marks, attacking a woman in the dark like common criminals. Evangeline stood perfectly still, her face hidden as always beneath the shadows of her shawl. But Barrett could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly before she clasped them together. "They destroyed her teacups," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion Barrett hadn't heard before. "Mother's wedding china. It was the only thing that survived the fire." The grief in those words hit Barrett harder than any physical blow. He found himself moving closer, drawn by an instinct to comfort that surprised him with its intensity. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I know what it means to lose the last pieces of someone you loved." She turned toward him then, and he caught another glimpse of those green eyes, this time bright with unshed tears. "Do you? Really?" Barrett thought of Margaret's wedding ring, which he still wore on a chain around his neck. Of the baby blanket she'd sewn during her pregnancy, now locked away in a cedar chest he couldn't bear to open. Of all the small, precious things that became precious only after the person who gave them meaning was gone. "Yes," he said, "I do." They stood together in the growing daylight, surrounded by the debris of someone else's cruelty, and Barrett felt something shift between them. The formal politeness that had characterized their earlier interactions gave way to something more genuine, a recognition of shared understanding that went beyond words. "What happens now?" Evangeline asked. "Now we make sure they don't try this again," Barrett replied grimly. "And we find out who's working for Pierce in this town." The investigation didn't take long. Barrett's years of reading people served him well as he made his rounds through Millbrook's businesses and saloons. Most folks were genuinely outraged by the attack on Evangeline's property. She might be a recluse, but she was their recluse, and attacking her was an affront to the community's sense of decency. But not everyone shared that sentiment. Barrett found what he was looking for at Murphy's Hardware, where the proprietor's nervous demeanor and evasive answers marked him as clearly as a brand. A few pointed questions and the promise of serious consequences if the harassment continued were enough to convince Murphy to reveal the names of the men Pierce had hired for his dirty work. "They're not from here," Murphy insisted, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool October air. "Drifters, mostly. Pierce promised them good money for simple jobs, watching the place, making noise, nothing violent." "Breaking windows isn't violent?" Barrett asked quietly. "That wasn't supposed to happen," Murphy said quickly. "Pierce just wanted to scare her into selling. He said no one would get hurt." Barrett leaned across the counter, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. "Mr. Murphy, I want you to carry a message to Pierce and his hired men. Tell them that Miss Hartwell is under my protection now. Any further attempts to intimidate or harass her will be met with consequences they won't enjoy. Do you understand me?" Murphy nodded frantically, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. "Good," Barrett continued, "because if I have to come back here to discuss this matter again, I won't be nearly as polite." Word of Barrett's warning spread through town with the speed of wildfire. By evening, even the Copper Bell Saloon had fallen unusually quiet, its patrons speaking in hushed tones about the confrontation at the hardware store. Barrett's reputation as a successful cattle baron was well known, but his willingness to personally involve himself in Evangeline's protection added a new dimension to how the town viewed both him and her. That evening, Barrett found Evangeline in what had once been her mother's garden, carefully tending to the few hardy plants that had survived years of neglect. She had traded her usual cloak for a simpler shawl that allowed more freedom of movement, though she still kept her face partially concealed. "The rosebush is still alive," she said as he approached, indicating a thorny specimen that showed signs of recent pruning. "Mother planted it the year they homesteaded this land. It survived drought, fire, and 20 years of Wyoming winters." Barrett knelt beside her, examining the hardy plant with genuine interest. "It's beautiful." She must have chosen the variety carefully. She did, said it reminded her of home back in Ohio, where she grew up. But she also said it needed to be strong enough for this country, because pretty things that couldn't survive the hard times weren't worth having. The metaphor wasn't lost on Barrett. He found himself studying Evangeline's profile as she worked, noting the determined set of her jaw and the gentle competence of her hands as she coaxed life from the neglected garden. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." She was. "She taught me that true strength isn't about never falling down, it's about getting back up every time you do." Evangeline paused in her work, her hands still among the thorny branches. "Some days I wonder if she'd be disappointed in how long I've stayed down." The vulnerability in her admission caught Barrett off guard. Without thinking, he reached out and gently touched her hand, feeling the slight tremor that ran through her at the contact. "You're not down," he said firmly. "You're surviving. There's a difference." She looked at him then. Really looked at him. And Barrett saw something in her eyes that made his heart race, a flicker of the woman she might have been, might still be, if she found the courage to step out of the shadows. "Mr. Sloan Barrett," she corrected herself softly, "may I ask you something personal?" "Of course. When your wife died, how long did it take before you felt like yourself again?" The question hit him like a physical blow, but he answered honestly, "I never did. The man I was before Margaret died, he's gone. The best I could do was build someone new from what was left." Evangeline nodded slowly, as if his answer confirmed something she'd suspected. "That's what I thought. People talk about healing as if you can go back to who you were before, but some wounds change you permanently, don't they?" "Yes," Barrett said quietly, "but that doesn't mean the person you become can't be strong or worthy of love." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Barrett wasn't even sure where they'd come from, only that they felt true in a way that surprised him. "The mining company," Evangeline said, changing the subject with obvious effort. "Do you think your warning will stop them?" Barrett considered the question seriously. Men like Pierce didn't abandon profitable ventures easily, and they certainly didn't respond well to threats from outsiders. For now, probably. But they'll be back with a different approach. Men like Pierce always have another angle. Then we should be prepared. The simple statement, delivered with quiet determination, impressed Barrett more than any declaration of defiance might have. Evangeline Hartwell wasn't just a victim hiding from the world. She was a fighter who had chosen her battles carefully. "We will be," Barrett promised, "together." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Barrett realized that somewhere along the way, protecting Evangeline had become more than a matter of principle. She had somehow become important to him in ways that both thrilled and terrified him. The silver pocket watch in his vest seemed to pulse with renewed life, as if time itself had begun moving forward again after years of standing still. Barrett wasn't sure what that meant, but for the first time since Margaret's death, he found himself looking toward the future with something that might have been hope. Barrett's warning had indeed quieted Pierce's hired troublemakers, but it had also attracted unwanted attention from an unexpected source. The telegram arrived at the hotel 3 days later, delivered by a nervous clerk who apologized for the delay. The message was brief and pointed. Heard you're playing knight-errant in Wyoming. Business suffering without your attention. Return immediately. William Hartman, Chief Financial Officer, Sloan Enterprises. Barrett stared at the yellow paper, feeling the weight of responsibilities he'd temporarily set aside. Hartman wasn't wrong. Barrett's absence from Colorado was creating problems. 2 major cattle contracts needed his personal attention, a railroad deal was stalling without his negotiation skills, and his ranch foremen were making decisions that required his approval. But the thought of leaving Evangeline to face Pierce and his schemes alone was intolerable. That evening, Barrett found her in the parlor of her house, seated at an old piano that had seen better days. She was playing softly, something classical and melancholy that spoke to the soul without need for words. Her fingers moved across the keys with practiced grace, and for the first time since meeting her, Barrett could see her face clearly in profile. The townspeople had been right, she was beautiful. But it was a beauty marked by sorrow, etched with lines of pain that spoke of trials endured in solitude. A thin scar ran along her left cheek from temple to jaw, pale against her skin but not disfiguring. Whatever damage the fire had done, it was far less severe than the stories suggested. She stopped playing when she sensed his presence, her hands falling still on the keys. "I didn't mean to interrupt," Barrett said gently. "Chopin," she replied, not turning to face him. "Mother taught me to play. She said music was the one language that could express what words couldn't reach." Barrett stepped into the room, noting the way candlelight softened the space and made it feel almost normal, like a home rather than a refuge. She was right about that. "You received news from Colorado," Evangeline observed. It wasn't a question. Somehow she'd sensed his troubled mood. Barrett showed her the telegram, watching as she read it with careful attention. When she handed it back, her expression was thoughtful but resigned. "You have to go," she said simply. "No, I don't. Your business, your life, it's all back there. This is just a temporary disruption, a detour from your real responsibilities." Barrett felt a surge of frustration that surprised him with its intensity. "Is that what you think this is? A detour?" For the first time since he'd entered the room, Evangeline turned to face him fully. The candlelight revealed the extent of her scars. They were there, certainly, but they were badges of survival rather than disfigurement. Her green eyes held a depth of feeling that took his breath away. "What else could it be?" she asked quietly. "You're a successful man, with a life that matters. I'm a recluse living in the past. We exist in different worlds, Barrett. Surely you can see that." "I see a woman who's been told her worth by people who don't understand her," Barrett replied firmly. "I see someone who survived tragedy and chose strength over bitterness. I see—" He stopped. Realizing he was about to voice feelings he wasn't sure he was ready to acknowledge. "What?" Evangeline asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you see?" Barrett moved closer, drawn by an impulse stronger than caution or social convention. "I see someone who makes me remember what it felt like to be alive. Someone who understands what it means to carry invisible wounds. Someone—" A loud crash from the kitchen cut through his words like a knife. Both Barrett and Evangeline froze, listening to the sound of heavy footsteps and muffled voices from the back of the house. "Stay here," Barrett whispered, reaching for the Colt. 45 he'd taken to carrying since the first attack. But Evangeline was already moving, her hand closing around an ancient rifle that had been leaning against the piano. "It's my house," she said firmly. "I won't hide in my own parlor." They moved together through the darkened hallway, their footsteps silent on the worn wooden floors. The voices from the kitchen became clearer as they approached 3 men, maybe 4, speaking in low tones about searching for documents. "Pierce sent us to find the deed," one voice said. "Boss wants proof of what kind of legal claim she's really got." "What if she comes back?" another asked nervously. "She won't. Johnson saw her leave town with that fancy cowboy an hour ago. We got plenty of time." Barrett felt his jaw tighten with anger. The intruders had been watching, waiting for what they thought was an opportunity to search the house undisturbed. Their mistake was assuming Evangeline would be predictable in her movements. Barrett caught Evangeline's eye and gestured toward the back door. They could slip outside and approach the kitchen from a different angle. But she shook her head and pointed toward the front of the house. She had a different plan. Moving with the quiet competence of someone who knew every creaking board in the structure, Evangeline led Barrett to the front door and then around the outside of the house. Barrett began to understand her strategy. As they positioned themselves near the kitchen's exterior door, they would trap the intruders inside, with nowhere to run. The plan worked perfectly. When Barrett kicked open the kitchen door with his gun drawn, the three men inside found themselves facing two determined defenders with no escape route. The confrontation was brief and decisive. Faced with Barrett's military bearing and Evangeline's steady rifle, the would-be burglars surrendered without resistance. "Gentlemen," Barrett said pleasantly as he bound their hands with rope from the barn, "you're going to have an interesting conversation with Sheriff Collins. I'm sure he'll be very curious about who hired you to break into a lady's home." After the sheriff hauled away the intruders, Barrett and Evangeline found themselves alone in the damaged kitchen. The men had ransacked the room thoroughly, dumping drawers and overturning furniture in their search for legal documents. "They were looking for the property deed," Evangeline said, surveying the mess with weary resignation. "Pierce must be getting desperate if he's resorting to common burglary." "Desperate men make dangerous mistakes," Barrett agreed, "but they also become more unpredictable. This won't be the end of it." Evangeline began righting overturned chairs and gathering scattered papers from the floor. Barrett joined her, noting how they worked together with easy coordination, as if they'd been partners for years rather than days. "The telegram from your business partner," Evangeline said as they worked. "You can't ignore those responsibilities forever." "I'm not ignoring them. I'm choosing to prioritize what's important." She stopped her cleaning and looked at him directly. "Am I important, Barrett? Or am I just a convenient way to avoid returning to a life that reminds you of everything you've lost?" The question was so perceptive, so cutting in its honesty, that Barrett had to sit down on one of the righted chairs. Was she right? Was his desire to protect her really about her? Or was it about his own need to feel useful, to matter to someone in a way that didn't involve business contracts and profit margins? "I don't know," he admitted finally. "Maybe both, but does the reason matter if the result is the same?" "It matters to me," Evangeline said softly, "because I won't be anyone's convenient escape from reality. I've spent 3 years learning to live with the truth of who I am and what I've lost. I won't go backward now." Barrett studied her face in the lamplight, seeing again the strength that lay beneath her careful reserve. She was right. She deserved better than to be someone's temporary refuge from a difficult life. "What if it's not temporary?" he asked. "What if I told you I've been more alive in these past weeks than I've been in years? What if I said that going back to Colorado feels like returning to a tomb?" Something flickered in Evangeline's eyes, hope maybe, or fear. "Then I'd say you need to be very sure about what you're choosing, because once you make that choice, there's no going back to the way things were." Barrett reached across the small space between them and gently touched her scarred cheek, marveling at the way she didn't pull away. "I know," he said quietly. "That's what terrifies me, and what gives me hope." Outside, the mountain wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying the promise of winter on its breath. But inside the lamplight kitchen, surrounded by the debris of another attack, Barrett Sloan felt warmer than he had in years. The revelation came 3 days later in the form of a weather-beaten journal Barrett discovered while helping Evangeline repair the damage from the break-in. He'd been moving boxes in the attic when his foot went through a loose floorboard, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a leather-bound book that would change everything he thought he knew about the Hartwell property and about his brother Thomas. Barrett recognized Thomas's handwriting immediately. The journal entries spanned 2 years, documenting his brother's time in Wyoming Territory with the kind of detail Thomas had never shared in his letters. But as Barrett read deeper, the entries revealed a truth that staggered him. Thomas hadn't come to Wyoming chasing another mining dream. He'd come because he'd discovered something, a secret that connected the Sloan family to the Hartwell property in ways Barrett had never imagined. "Evangeline," Barrett called softly as she climbed the attic stairs. "You need to see this." She settled beside him on the dusty floor, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used and feel the warmth of her presence. Barrett opened the journal to the entry that had shaken him most profoundly. "October 15th, 1887, he read aloud, "finally found the courage to tell Evangeline the truth today. Her father's not the only one with secrets in this family. The fire that killed her mother, it wasn't an accident. I know because I was there. I know because it was my fault." Evangeline went perfectly still beside him, her breath catching audibly. Barrett continued reading, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "I was young and stupid, working as a surveyor for the territorial government. Met a girl in a saloon in Cheyenne, Sally Morrison, said her name was, though I later learned it was Sally Pierce, Nathaniel Pierce's sister. She was beautiful and charming, and I was lonely enough to fall for every lie she told me. Sally convinced me that certain wealthy landowners were hiding mineral claims to avoid federal taxes. Said if I could get copies of property surveys, particularly the valuable ones like the Hartwell spread, we could expose the fraud and split the reward money. I believed her because I wanted to believe her. I broke into the land office and copied every survey map I could find, including the detailed geological reports old Jeremiah Hartwell had commissioned. Sally disappeared with the documents the next day, and I thought that was the end of it. 3 weeks later, the Hartwell house caught fire in the middle of the night. Mary Hartwell died trying to save her daughter from the flames. By the time I heard about it and realized what had really happened, it was too late. Pierce had used my stolen surveys to plan a raid on the property, looking for something he thought Hartwell was hiding. They set the fire to cover their tracks when they didn't find what they wanted. Evangeline survived, but she was scarred not just by the flames but by losing her mother, and I was the fool who made it possible. Barrett closed the journal, his hands shaking. The silence in the attic was profound, broken only by the sound of Evangeline's careful breathing. "You knew," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You knew about this when you offered to help me." "No." Barrett turned to face her, desperate to make her understand. "I swear to you, Evangeline, I had no idea. I thought Thomas came here for mining, just like he told me. I never knew about any of this." Evangeline stood abruptly, moving to the small attic window that looked out over her mother's garden. Barrett could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself rigidly upright, as if movement might shatter her composure. "Your brother was in love with me," she said quietly. "Did the journal tell you that too?" Barrett flipped through more pages, finding entries that confirmed her words. Thomas had indeed fallen in love with Evangeline deeply, hopelessly in love with a woman who couldn't see past his connection to her mother's death. "He wanted to marry me," Evangeline continued, still facing the window. "Proposed twice. Said he could give me a new life somewhere far from here, somewhere I could start fresh. But how could I marry the man whose foolishness killed my mother?" Barrett felt the full weight of the revelation settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. Thomas hadn't just been storing equipment at the Hartwell place, he'd been courting Evangeline, trying to make amends for a mistake that had cost her everything. "He stayed here for 2 years, Barrett said, reading from another entry, "working odd jobs, sending money back home, but really just trying to earn forgiveness he couldn't have," Evangeline finished. "Your brother was a good man, Barrett, but he was trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed." Barrett studied her profile against the dusty window light, seeing new layers of complexity in her story. She hadn't withdrawn from the world simply because of her scars. She'd withdrawn because the man she might have loved was connected to her deepest trauma. "Is that why you hide?" Barrett asked gently. "Not because of how you look, but because of what you remember?" Evangeline turned from the window then, and Barrett saw tears tracking down her cheeks the first time he'd seen her cry. "Every time I looked at Thomas, I saw the flames," she whispered. "Every time he spoke kindly to me, I heard my mother's voice calling for help. He tried so hard to make things right, but every gesture just reminded me of what I'd lost." Barrett set the journal aside and moved closer to her, drawn by an instinct to comfort that overrode his uncertainty about where they stood now that the truth was revealed. "And now," he asked, "when you look at me, what do you see?" Evangeline studied his face with those remarkable green eyes, as if searching for something she needed to find. "I see his brother," she said finally, "but I also see something different. Someone who didn't know the truth when he chose to help me. Someone who stayed even when staying became complicated." Barrett felt relief wash through him, followed immediately by a deeper understanding of the obstacles they still faced. "Evangeline, I need you to know everything I've felt for you, everything I've done. It has nothing to do with my brother's guilt. You matter to me for your own sake, not because of Thomas's mistakes." She moved closer then, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, the way her lashes curved against her scarred cheek. "I want to believe that," she said softly, "but how can I be sure? How can either of us be sure that what we feel isn't just convenient substitution? You replacing your lost wife with a woman your brother couldn't have. Me replacing the love I couldn't accept with something safer?" The questions hung between them like a chasm neither knew how to cross. Barrett realized that Thomas's journal had done more than reveal the past. It had forced them both to confront the complexity of their present feelings. "There's more," Barrett said reluctantly, indicating the journal. "About Pierce. About why he's so determined to get this property." Evangeline wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, composing herself with visible effort. "Tell me." Barrett found the relevant entries, reading about Pierce's ongoing obsession with the Hartwell land. According to Thomas's notes, Pierce believed that Jeremiah Hartwell had discovered a significant silver deposit somewhere on the property. The original break-in that led to the fire had been an attempt to find geological surveys that would pinpoint the location. "Pierce has been searching for that silver for 20 years, Barrett said. "Every scheme, every attempt to get your land, it's all about finding what he thinks your father hid." "But there is no silver," Evangeline said with certainty. "Father would have told me. We were struggling financially for years before he died. If there was valuable mineral deposits on this land, don't you think he would have used them?" Barrett considered this, flipping through more of Thomas's careful observations. Near the end of the journal, he found an entry that made his blood run cold. "November 3rd, 1889, he read. "Pierce is running out of patience. Overheard him talking to his men in town yesterday. He's planning something big. Said if he can't get the land legally, he'll make sure there's nothing left to fight over. Think he means to burn her out, just like he did her mother." Barrett closed the journal with a snap, his mind racing. If Pierce was planning to destroy the property, they had very little time to stop him. "We have to leave," Barrett said urgently. "Tonight. This property isn't worth your life, Evangeline." But she was already shaking her head, that familiar steel entering her posture. "No, I won't run from my home again. My mother died here, and I've lived here through 3 years of grief and healing. This is where I make my stand." Barrett saw the determination in her eyes and knew that argument would be futile. Evangeline Hartwell had found her courage again, and she intended to use it. The question was whether they could survive what was coming next. Barrett spent the next 2 hours transforming Evangeline's homestead into a fortress. His years of military service during the Indian Wars had taught him how to fortify positions under pressure, and he applied those lessons with methodical precision. If Pierce was planning an attack, Barrett intended to be ready. He moved through the property with practiced efficiency, noting sightlines and defensive advantages. The house itself was well positioned on a slight rise, offering clear views of all approaches. The barn could serve as a secondary defensive position if needed, and the well provided a reliable water source even under siege conditions. But Barrett's most valuable asset wasn't tactical, it was Evangeline herself. As she helped him prepare, he discovered that her 3 years of solitude had honed skills most people never developed. She knew every sound the property made, could identify the difference between natural settling and human movement, and moved through the buildings with the silent precision of someone who had learned to avoid unwanted attention. "The root cellar," she said as they discussed fallback positions. "It connects to a natural cave system that runs under the property. Father showed me the passages when I was young, said they were old Indian hiding places. There's an exit near the creek, about a quarter-mile from the house." Barrett studied her with new appreciation. "You've been planning for something like this." "Not this specifically, but I've thought about what I'd do if when someone finally decided I was more trouble than I was worth." Evangeline checked the loading of her rifle with movements that spoke of familiarity with weapons. "I may have hidden from the world, Barrett, but I never stopped preparing to defend myself." As evening approached, Barrett made one final trip to town, ostensibly to send a telegram to his business partner, but actually to gather intelligence about Pierce's activities. What he learned confirmed his worst fears. Pierce had indeed been recruiting men, not just drifters this time, but experienced fighters with military backgrounds. The mining company executive had apparently decided that subtlety was a luxury he could no longer afford. If he couldn't acquire the Hartwell property through legal means or intimidation, he would simply eliminate the obstacles to his goal. "Sheriff Collins wants to help," Barrett reported when he returned to the homestead. "But Pierce has been careful to stay within the letter of the law. Unless we can prove he's planning violence, Collins can't act preemptively." Pentaitu 3 said. "So we're on our own," Evangeline said matter-of-factly. She was cleaning her father's old hunting rifle, her movements sure and competent. "Not entirely. I sent word to some friends in Colorado, men I served with, who understand this kind of situation. But they won't arrive for several days, assuming they come at all." Evangeline looked up from her weapon maintenance, studying Barrett's face in the lamplight. "You're asking a lot of people to take risks for someone they've never met." "I'm asking friends to help someone who matters to me," Barrett corrected gently. "There's a difference." The simple statement hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to explore fully. Their feelings for each other had become more complex since discovering Thomas's journal tangled up with guilt and questions about motivation that couldn't be easily resolved. "Barrett," Evangeline said carefully, "after this is over, after Pierce is dealt with one way or another, what happens then?" It was the question Barrett had been avoiding, the one that cut to the heart of their impossible situation. His life was in Colorado, built around businesses and responsibilities he couldn't simply abandon. Hers was here, rooted in soil watered by her mother's blood and her own tears. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know I can't go back to the way things were before I met you." Evangeline set down her rifle and moved to the window, peering out at the gathering darkness. "Pierce will come tonight. I can feel it the same way I could feel the storm before that fire 20 years ago." Barrett joined her at the window, noting how she stood slightly apart from him, maintaining the careful distance she'd kept since learning about Thomas's role in her mother's death. The revelation had changed something fundamental between them, introducing doubt where there had been growing trust. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "Terrified," she replied honestly, "but not of dying. I'm afraid of—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I'm afraid of losing something I didn't know I wanted until it was threatened." Barrett understood. He'd felt the same fear growing in his chest over the past few days, not fear of Pierce's violence, but fear of losing the connection he'd found with Evangeline. The possibility that tonight might end not just in death, but in the destruction of something precious and fragile. "There's something I need to tell you," Barrett said, his voice low and urgent. "Something I should have said before, regardless of what happens tonight." Evangeline turned from the window to face him, her green eyes wide and attentive in the lamplight. "I know the timing is impossible, and I know our situation is complicated by my brother's history. I know you have every reason to doubt my motives and question whether what I feel is real." Barrett took a breath, steadying himself for words he'd never expected to say again. "But I love you, Evangeline. Not because of Thomas's guilt or my own grief, but because you're the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever met. Because you make me remember what it feels like to be truly alive." Evangeline's breath caught audibly, her hand moving involuntarily to her throat. For a long moment she simply stared at him, as if trying to read the truth of his words in his eyes. "Barrett, she began, then stopped as the sound of approaching horses cut through the night air. Both of them moved to the window immediately, Barrett blowing out the lamp to avoid silhouetting themselves against the glass. In the moonlight, they could see riders approaching the property, too many riders, moving with the purposeful coordination of men on a mission. "How many?" Evangeline whispered. Barrett counted quickly, his heart sinking. 8, maybe 9. More than I hoped, fewer than I feared. "They're spreading out," Evangeline observed, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Surrounding the house. They mean to trap us inside." Barrett checked his weapons one final time, his Colt. .45, a rifle he'd borrowed from Morrison, and a knife he'd carried since his army days. Not much against 9 men, but he'd faced worse odds and lived to tell about it. "The plan is simple," he said quietly. "We hold the house as long as possible, then fall back to the root cellar if we have to. Whatever happens, we stay together." Evangeline nodded, her own rifle ready. But she reached out and caught his arm as he moved toward the front of the house. "Barrett," she said softly, "what you just told me, I need you to know that I—" The crash of breaking glass from the kitchen cut off her words. Pierce's men had begun their assault. "Positions," Barrett whispered urgently, but Evangeline was already moving with the fluid grace he'd come to admire. Whatever she'd been about to say would have to wait. The first shots came from 3 directions simultaneously, a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm their defenses. Barrett and Evangeline responded with disciplined fire, making every shot count while conserving ammunition. The advantage of fighting from a defended position was real but limited. Eventually, superior numbers would tell. "They're testing us," Barrett called out as a lull settled over the gunfight, "seeing how many we are and how well armed. What will they do when they figure out it's just the 2 of us?" Barrett didn't answer immediately, focused on tracking movement in the shadows outside. When he spoke, his voice was grimly realistic. "They'll burn us out, just like they did your mother." Evangeline went very still at those words, but when she spoke, her voice carried a note of fierce determination Barrett hadn't heard before. "Then we'd better make sure they don't get the chance." Outside, Pierce's voice called through the darkness with false courtesy. "Miss Hartwell, Mr. Sloan, let's discuss this like civilized people. No one needs to get hurt tonight." Barrett almost laughed at the absurdity. Pierce had brought 9 armed men to a woman's home in the middle of the night and was talking about civilization. "What do you want, Pierce?" Barrett called back. "Simple business transaction. Miss Hartwell signs over her land rights and everyone walks away healthy. She can even keep enough money to start fresh somewhere else." "And if she refuses?" There was a pause before Pierce replied, and when he did, all pretense of civility was gone. "Then we'll take the land anyway and bury anyone fool enough to stand in our way." Barrett felt Evangeline move closer to him in the darkness, close enough that he could feel her warmth and steady breathing. Despite everything, the danger, the impossible odds, the unresolved questions between them, he felt a strange sense of completeness. "Your answer, Miss Hartwell?" Pierce called. Evangeline moved to the broken window, her rifle steady in her hands. When she spoke, her voice carried across the night with clear authority. "Come and take it." The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Barrett felt a surge of fierce admiration for this woman who had found her courage at the moment when it mattered most. Pierce's response came in the form of gunfire, not the careful probing shots of before, but a sustained barrage designed to shatter their defenses and force them into the open. The final battle for the Hartwell homestead had begun. The sustained gunfire shattered the night silence, muzzle flashes blooming like deadly flowers in the darkness around the homestead. Barrett and Evangeline moved with practiced coordination, despite having never fought together before, she to the kitchen window, he to the front parlor, both keeping low as bullets whined through the air above their heads. Barrett's military training served him well now. He could tell from the pattern of fire that Pierce's men were professionals, but they were also impatient. They were expending ammunition at a rate that suggested they expected quick victory rather than a prolonged siege. "2 men moving on the barn," Evangeline called out, her voice steady despite the chaos. 3 more behind the old chicken coop. Barrett risked a quick glance through the front window and spotted movement near the well. "They're trying to cut off our water source," he realized. Classic siege tactic. A burning arrow sailed through the broken kitchen window, embedding itself in the wooden floor. Evangeline stamped out the flames quickly, but the message was clear. Pierce intended to burn them out, just as he had her mother. "The root cellar," Barrett said urgently. "It's time." But Evangeline shook her head firmly. "Not yet. There's something I need to retrieve first." Before Barrett could protest, she was moving through the house with swift purpose. He heard her footsteps on the stairs, then overhead, in what must have been her parents' old bedroom. More arrows came through the windows, several finding purchase in furniture and curtains. Barrett worked frantically to extinguish the growing fires while keeping watch for Pierce's men. They were closing the circle, moving from shadow to shadow with the confidence of hunters who had cornered their prey. Evangeline returned carrying a small metal strongbox, her face streaked with smoke, but determined. "My mother's jewelry," she explained quickly, "and something else Pierce wants." Barrett didn't have time to ask what she meant. The front door exploded inward under the impact of a rifle butt, and 2 of Pierce's men rushed into the parlor with guns drawn. Barrett met them with his Colt, the confined space making accuracy easier despite the poor light. Both men went down, but Barrett knew their position was compromised. "Now the cellar," he said grimly. They made their way through the smoke-filled house to the kitchen, where a trapdoor concealed the entrance to the underground passages Evangeline had mentioned. The strongbox she carried seemed heavier than it should have been, but Barrett didn't question her priorities. Everyone had things they couldn't bear to lose. The root cellar was cool and dark, lit only by the orange glow filtering down from the burning house above. Barrett could hear Pierce's men moving through the rooms overhead, their boots heavy on the wooden floors as they searched for bodies or survivors. "The passage is this way," Evangeline whispered, leading him deeper into the underground space. The corridor she revealed was narrow but well-maintained, carved from solid rock by water and time. They moved quickly, but carefully. The strongbox clutched against Evangeline's chest like a lifeline. Behind them, the house burned with increasing intensity. Barrett could hear the roar of flames, consuming everything Evangeline had left of her former life. He wanted to comfort her, to acknowledge what she was losing, but their survival depended on reaching the exit before Pierce's men realized their quarry had escaped. The passage seemed to stretch endlessly through the darkness, but finally Barrett saw starlight ahead, the exit near the creek that Evangeline had promised. They emerged into a grove of cottonwood trees, the sound of running water masking their movements. "We need to reach town," Barrett said quietly. "Get Sheriff Collins and—" "No," Evangeline interrupted, setting down the strongbox and opening it with shaking hands. "There's something Pierce doesn't know. Something that changes everything." Barrett watched as she withdrew not jewelry, but a collection of documents, surveys, geological reports, and what appeared to be a contract signed by her father years before his death. "Father did find silver on this land," Evangeline said, her voice barely audible over the creek's murmur. More than Pierce ever imagined, but he also found something else: evidence that Pierce murdered a federal surveyor to cover up his illegal mining activities. These documents prove it. Barrett stared at the papers, understanding dawning. That's what Pierce has really been after. Not just the silver, but the evidence that could hang him. Father hid these before he died, told me to use them only if our survival depended on it. Evangeline's hands shook as she held the documents. I never imagined it would come to this. The sound of horses approaching made them both freeze. Pierce hadn't been fooled by the burning house. He'd sent men to watch the likely escape routes. Barrett grabbed the documents and pulled Evangeline deeper into the trees. Can we reach town through the creek bed? Yes, but Barrett. She caught his arm as they began to move. What I was trying to tell you before, when Pierce's men attacked, what you said about loving me. Tell me later, Barrett said urgently, hearing the hoofbeats getting closer. When we're safe. There might not be a later, Evangeline insisted, her green eyes fierce in the starlight. I need you to know I love you too. Despite everything, because of everything, I love you. The words hit Barrett like a physical blow, filling him with more warmth than any fire. But before he could respond, the sound of men crashing through the underbrush told him their hiding place had been discovered. There, a voice shouted. By the creek. Barrett grabbed Evangeline's hand, and together they plunged into the icy water. The evidence of Pierce's crimes clutched between them as bullets began to fly once again. The creek water was shockingly cold, stealing their breath and numbing their limbs within seconds. Barrett held tight to Evangeline's hand as they half ran, half stumbled downstream, using the creek bed as both highway and concealment. Behind them, Pierce's men crashed through the underbrush, their curses carrying clearly through the mountain air. They can't track us in the water, Barrett panted, but we can't stay in here long without risking hypothermia. Evangeline nodded, her teeth already chattering from the cold. The strongbox made their flight awkward, but she refused to abandon it despite Barrett's practical suggestions. The evidence it contained was their only leverage against a man who had already proven he would kill to protect his secrets. A rifle shot echoed off the canyon walls, followed by Pierce's voice bellowing orders to his men. Find them! They can't have gone far in this terrain. Barrett pulled Evangeline behind a fallen log that spanned the creek, giving them temporary cover while they caught their breath. In the distance, her house continued to burn, the flames visible through the trees like an angry red eye in the darkness. I'm sorry, Barrett whispered, watching the destruction of everything she'd called home for 3 years. Don't be, Evangeline replied firmly. It was just a building. What matters is what we save. She gestured to the strongbox, and Barrett understood that she wasn't just talking about the documents. They were saving each other, saving the possibility of a future neither had dared imagine just days before. The sound of approaching horses forced them to move again. Barrett helped Evangeline out of the creek and into a dense thicket of willows that offered concealment. They were perhaps halfway to town now, but the direct route would take them across open meadowland where they'd be visible to mounted pursuers. There's another way, Evangeline said, reading his thoughts. A deer trail that follows the ridge. It's longer, but it stays in the trees. They began the climb up from the creek bottom, their wet clothes making every movement difficult. Barrett's lungs burned in the thin mountain air, but Evangeline seemed to draw strength from the familiar terrain. This was her country, and she moved through it with the confidence of someone who had walked these paths in darkness many times before. The deer trail was narrow and treacherous, winding between massive pine trees and over rocky outcroppings that would have challenged them even in daylight. But it offered something more valuable than ease, complete concealment from Pierce's mounted searchers. They had been climbing for perhaps 20 minutes when they heard horses on the trail below. Pierce himself was riding point, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air as he questioned his men about their quarry's possible routes. They're heading for town, Pierce said with certainty. Sloan thinks he can get the sheriff involved, use those documents to turn this into a legal matter. His laugh was bitter and dangerous. He doesn't understand that some problems require permanent solutions. Barrett felt Evangeline tense beside him at those words. Pierce wasn't just talking about destroying evidence, he was talking about eliminating witnesses. They continued their careful ascent, the strongbox growing heavier with each step. Barrett offered to carry it repeatedly, but Evangeline maintained her grip with stubborn determination. Finally, they crested the ridge and could see the lights of Millbrook spread out in the valley below. "We made it," Evangeline breathed, relief obvious in her voice. But Barrett's military instincts were screaming warnings. Something was wrong, the town was too quiet, too dark. Even at this late hour, there should have been more activity, more lights in windows. Pierce got here first, Barrett realized grimly. "Look, the sheriff's office is dark, so is the hotel." Evangeline studied the scene below, her face pale in the starlight. "He bought them off, or scared them off. We're on our own." Barrett considered their options. They could try to reach the church, hope that Reverend Hamilton would offer sanctuary, or they could attempt to make it to the telegraph office and send for help from outside authorities. But both options required crossing the open main street, where they'd be vulnerable to attack. "There's one more choice," Barrett said slowly. "We go back to Pierce directly. Use the evidence as a bargaining chip." "That's suicide," Evangeline protested. "Those documents are the only thing keeping us alive." "Maybe. Or maybe they're the key to ending this permanently." Barrett turned to face her, his hands gentle on her shoulders despite the urgency of their situation. "Evangeline, Pierce isn't going to stop. Even if we escape tonight, he'll keep coming. The only way to end this is to destroy him completely." She studied his face in the dim light, reading the determination there. "You have a plan. The beginning of one, but it requires taking a tremendous risk." Evangeline was quiet for a long moment, weighing their limited options. When she spoke, her voice carried the same steel Barrett had heard when she defied Pierce's ultimatum at the house. "Tell me what you need me to do." Barrett felt a surge of admiration for this remarkable woman, who had found her courage at exactly the moment when it mattered most. "We're going to give Pierce exactly what he wants and make sure it destroys him." The plan forming in Barrett's mind was dangerous beyond reason, dependent on precise timing and Pierce's own greed. But it was their only chance to end the threat permanently and build a future together. In the distance, church bells began to toll midnight, marking the end of one day and the beginning of another. Barrett hoped it would also mark the beginning of their real lives together. Barrett's plan was elegantly simple and terrifyingly dangerous. They would arrange a meeting with Pierce at the burned ruins of Evangeline's house, ostensibly to negotiate the surrender of the incriminating documents in exchange for safe passage out of Wyoming Territory. But Barrett had no intention of surrendering anything. Instead, he planned to use Pierce's greed and desperation to trap the man into confessing his crimes in front of witnesses. The key was Sheriff Collins, who Barrett suspected was more intimidated than corrupt. A lawman faced with clear evidence of Pierce's criminal activities and federal crimes at that would have little choice but to act, regardless of any previous arrangements or threats. They made their way back down the ridge as dawn approached, Evangeline leading them along paths she'd known since childhood. The burned remains of her house were still smouldering when they arrived, wisps of smoke curling up from the blackened timbers like prayers for the dead. Barrett positioned himself in the barn, the only structure that had escaped the flames, while Evangeline took her place near the old oak tree where they'd first truly seen each other. The strongbox sat prominently at the base of the tree, clearly visible to anyone approaching the property. They didn't have to wait long. Pierce arrived with 4 men just as the sun crested the mountains, painting the devastation in shades of gold and crimson. He rode directly to where Evangeline stood, his confidence restored now that he believed victory was within reach. "Miss Hartwell," Pierce said with mock courtesy, dismounting near the oak tree. I trust you've reconsidered my generous offer. The documents are in the box, Evangeline replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. But I want your word that Mr. Sloan and I will be allowed to leave Wyoming Territory unharmed. Pierce's smile was coldly triumphant. Of course. I'm a businessman, not a murderer, though I must say, you've caused me considerable trouble and expense. Barrett held his breath, waiting for the moment when Pierce would reveal too much. The mining executive's arrogance was his greatest weakness. He couldn't resist explaining how clever he'd been, how completely he'd outmaneuvered his opponents. You know, Pierce continued, opening the strongbox with eager hands, your father was a fool to hide these documents for so long. If he'd simply sold me the land when I first approached him, none of this unpleasantness would have been necessary. Your mother would still be alive. The casual admission sent a chill down Barrett's spine. Pierce had just confessed to murder within earshot of Sheriff Collins, who had positioned himself behind the remains of the chicken coop exactly as Barrett had arranged. You killed her deliberately, Evangeline said, her voice carrying just enough shock to encourage Pierce to elaborate. Not personally, of course, but sometimes fires get out of hand during business negotiations. These things happen in frontier territories where law enforcement is flexible. Pierce continued sorting through the documents, his attention focused entirely on the papers that represented 20 years of patient scheming. He didn't notice Sheriff Collins emerging from concealment with his rifle drawn, or the arrival of Barrett's friends from Colorado, 3 former cavalry officers who had ridden hard through the night in response to his telegram. That's enough, Collins said firmly, his weapon trained on Pierce and his men. Nathaniel Pierce, you're under arrest for the murder of Mary Hartwell, conspiracy to commit arson, forgery of federal documents, and the bribery of public officials. Pierce's head snapped up, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and calculation in rapid succession. For a moment, Barrett thought the man might try to fight his way out, despite being outnumbered and outgunned. But Pierce had spent his life avoiding physical confrontation, preferring to work through hired proxies and legal manipulation. You have no proof, Pierce said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. I have your confession, Collins replied, spoken in front of multiple witnesses and recorded by the territorial court reporter I brought along for this occasion. Barrett emerged from the barn, his rifle ready but not directly threatening. Pierce's men had already surrendered their weapons rather than face 3 professional soldiers and an armed sheriff. The battle was over before it had truly begun. Mr. Pierce, Barrett said conversationally, I believe you mentioned something about permanent solutions to certain problems. I trust you'll find the territorial prison solutions quite permanent indeed. As Collins and his deputies led Pierce away in shackles, Barrett found himself alone with Evangeline among the ruins of her former life. The strongbox lay empty beside the oak tree, its contents having served their purpose at last. It's finished, Evangeline said softly, removing her shawl and letting the morning sunlight touch her face without concealment for the first time since Barrett had known her. The scars were there, yes, but they were part of her beauty, rather than a diminishment of it. This part is finished, Barrett agreed, moving closer to her, but I'd like to think we're just beginning. Evangeline turned to face him fully, her green eyes bright with tears and hope in equal measure. What happens now? Your business in Colorado, your responsibilities, can be managed from anywhere, Barrett interrupted gently. I've spent years building an empire, Evangeline, but empires are worthless without someone to share them with. She stepped into his embrace then, and Barrett felt the silver pocket watch in his vest begin to tick again, not marking the end of something, but the beginning of a life he'd never dared imagine possible. I love you, she whispered against his chest, not because of what you've done for me, but because of who you are when you think no one is watching. Then marry me, Barrett said, the words coming easily despite their magnitude. Help me build something better than what either of us had before. Evangeline pulled back to look into his eyes, and Barrett saw his own hope reflected there. Yes, she said simply. "Yes, I will." As they kissed beneath the ancient oak tree, surrounded by the ashes of the past and the promise of the future, Barrett realized that sometimes the deepest wounds could indeed heal not by forgetting what had been lost, but by finding the courage to risk loving again. The silver pocket watch ticked steadily against his chest, marking time that was no longer standing still, but moving forward toward whatever tomorrow might bring.